All right, so this is going to be an introduction of cellular energy. Talk a little bit about how the cell is able to do processes that require energy, and then move into fermentation. Right, so this is a little bit of a review. We got our two types of organisms. It could either be an autotroph, meaning they make their own food. Those would be plants and other things that carry on photosynthesis, or they're a heterotroph. Means they consume other organisms for food. And all living things need energy to survive. Energy is the ability to do work. That would be the definition that you would have gotten last year from physical science. Most of the energy for all things comes from the sun, so most of it's sunlight. There are some bacteria that are able to harness energy from inorganic molecules. The way that we measure the amount of energy in an organism is called a calorie, and that's the amount of energy needed to raise the temperature of 1 gram of water 1 degree Celsius. So it's a controlled measure. 1 gram of water is always going to be the same amount, and move it 1 degree Celsius. And then we got some examples of what you could do with the energy. With 5 pounds of spaghetti, you could brew a pot of coffee. With 1 piece of cheesecake, it's got enough energy to run a 60-watt light bulb for an hour and a half. And if you had 217 Big Macs, you could use that energy to drive a car 88 miles. Between the macromolecules that we talked about, so you have a little bit of a background. You have carbohydrates, protein, and lipids. And lipids, in this case, we're just going to call them fats. Remember that lipids could be fats, oils, or waxes. And they have different calorie amounts. So the amount of energy stored in is based upon the number of bonds that molecule has. Carbohydrates and protein have 4 kilocalories per gram. And then fats, because they have that long chain, they have the long fatty acid. That's just the carbon and hydrogen. You've got a lot of bonds there. You can pack a lot of energy in. They've got more calories per gram. So per weight, fat has more calories. That's why if you eat foods that are high in fat, you're going to get a lot of calories and tendency to gain weight. So if you eat fatty foods, it's not just you're getting fatter because you're eating fat. It's because of the energy inside of that fat. So anything that goes into your body, unless you burn those calories off, is going to get stored on your body as fat. And so we have cellular energy, and take those calories and put that energy into something else. Okay, so how does the cell make these things? Like, how does it run protein channels? How does it do transport? It has this clever little storage molecule called ATP. ATP is not really good at long-term storage. So sugar, so an example would be glucose molecule, has 90 times the energy of ATP. So if you're going to store sugar, you want to store energy, you want to store it as sugar, as a glucose molecule. But ATP allows you to keep a small store on hand that's easy to move, easy to transport. And then you can send that little ATP around anywhere. And when it releases a phosphate, that's how it releases energy. By adding on phosphates, it adds on charge. It kind of adds on a little storage of energy. And then to actually make something happen, it releases a phosphate bond. And that's how it releases energy for making a reaction happen. So it basically transitions between ADP, which is adenosine diphosphate, so that's 2 phosphates, to adenosine triphosphate, and it just flips back and forth. ADP is kind of like the uncharged battery, and then ATP is the fully charged battery. Here's a picture of it here. Here's the adenine ribose sugar, and then here's the 3-phosphate. So this is the part of the molecule that transitions back and forth. When it's ADP, you have 1, 2 phosphates. When it's ATP, you have this 3rd phosphate. And you break this bond here to release energy. So what's an example? What would that look like if we were to go to look at how active transport happens? And this would be probably somewhere in a muscle, looking at sodium and potassium pumps. Active transport can help you pump molecules across a membrane. And if you think back to what you know about active transport, that's going to pump molecules against the concentration gradient. So without using any energy, molecules want to move from high concentration to low. Using this pump, you can reverse the flow. You can pump them from low concentration back to high concentration. And kind of the cell uses that pump to kind of set up and run different processes that it wants to do. I'm going to load up a video of a sodium-potassium pump.
The sodium-potassium pump is an active transport mechanism. Three sodium ions bind to the protein channel, and an ATP provides the energy to change the shape of the channel that in turn drives the ion channel. One phosphate group from the ATP remains bound with the channel. The sodium ions are released on the other side of the membrane outside of the cell, and the new shape of the channel has a high affinity for potassium ions, and 2 of these ions now bind to the channel. This binding again causes a change in the shape of the protein channel, and this conformational change releases the phosphate group on the cytoplasm side. This release allows the channel to revert to its original shape, and as a result, the potassium ions are released inside the cell. In its original shape, the channel has a high affinity for sodium ions, and when these ions bind again, they initiate another cycle. The important characteristic of this pump is that both sodium and potassium ions are moving from areas of low concentration to areas of high concentration. That is to say, each ion is moving against its concentration gradient. This type of movement can only be achieved by the constant expenditure of ATP energy.
Sweet. So that's what it would look like in action. Now I want to focus in on, so we talked about ATP, which is a really versatile molecule used in different energy processes. So the most simple form of cellular, the ability for a cell to get energy is fermentation. We're going to study it first using yeast, and we're going to make root beer. And fermentation you could think of as the most primitive. If there was a cellular energy when it first evolved, cells having the ability to use energy, fermentation would have been one of the first processes that early cells could have done. So in organisms and in humans, if your cell can't get oxygen, it's going to carry out, if it can't get oxygen, then it needs to carry out aerobic respiration. It carries out fermentation instead to make ATP. It's less effective, and it doesn't make as much ATP. So the next thing we'll learn about is respiration, but right now we're going to focus on fermentation. Fermentation happens in the cytoplasm. It isn't a clean burn, so nasty or intoxicating waste products are left behind. There are 2 types of fermentation. You have alcoholic fermentation, and that's one that produces ethanol as a waste product, and that's what humans use to produce beer, wine. It's also what we do to make bread rise. And then in our human body, we can't just walk around and produce alcohol inside of our body. And so that process has been adapted within animal cells, and it's called lactic acid fermentation. Um, Produces lactic acid as a waste product. Um, so what does lactic acid fermentation look like? You have a total of 2 ATP molecules are made for each molecule of glucose. So you have 1 molecule of glucose, and you make 2 ATP. There's another helper molecule called NADP, um, and that molecule gets continually regenerated so that the process can keep going. It's a low energy yield process, making only 2 ATPs, but it can be enough to sustain our cells when we can't get enough oxygen. So the reason you don't just freeze and shut down when you can't get oxygen to your muscles is that this process is still going on. It's like a backup generator for a hospital. When the normal way of getting power goes out, you've got this backup process for energy. And that is it. Okay, see you back in class.